Now, many of you may know, and I think it's been mentioned here, that I wrote a book about Jacksonville Cemetery. I called it Silent City on the Hill. Library has copies. They have copies of my other books too, which I appreciate. Today we're going to be talking about Medford's Silent City, Eastwood-I.O.O.F. Cemetery. Now some have speculated that maybe I'm being just a little bit too flippant, being a little nasty by calling it a silent city. But guess what? It's not a joke, and I wasn't trying to fool anyone. The fact is that our ancestors, our grandparents, great-grandparents, were calling these cemeteries silent cities for almost 200 years at least as far back as I can trace. I even found The Silent City on the Hill, the name of that book, in a newspaper from Jacksonville in about 1884, 85, something like that. When you think about it, Silent City does seem kind of appropriate. It almost symbolizes the way, well, the difference between the way we think of cemeteries and the way our grandparents and forefathers and grandfathers thought about it. In 1875, I think that was about the time, an unknown writer wrote that a cemetery is not merely a place of the dead. It's a shrine of living hope and faith. Its markers are as sacred as the hearthstones of our home, and all of our past lives still live there. To the Southern Oregon pioneer, cemetery was indeed a silent city. Community garden where those alive could visit with relatives and friends who had already passed on. In a time when there really were no public parks to speak of, cemetery was a peaceful and comfortable refuge shared between the living and the dead. Unlike our sterile modern memorial parks, Pioneer Cemetery really teemed with life. Family picnics were not unusual in the cemetery. Parents strolled with children amongst the marble and the granite stones, and they would pause just long enough to tell stories about grandpa, grandma, a lost brother, a lost sister, a lost baby. Today, unfortunately, cemeteries seem to be the places we visit only when we have to, or for some reason. And that's a shame, because there's so much humanity that still lives there if you take the time to look into it. Now, helping me out today, I have a volunteer correspondent on the scene, semi-live. I want to introduce you to Video Bill, who I hope will show up near the Eastwood-I.O.O.F. Cemetery. Hey, right you are, Bill. Here I am, right at the front gate of Eastwood-I.O.O.F. Cemetery. This is not the original entrance, but it's been reconstructed over the last few years. You used to be able to take a streetcar right up here to the street and then walk in. Now that was back in the mid-1910s. It's been long gone. So why don't we take a look inside? Well, the interesting part about all of this is this cemetery actually started in 1891, but it wasn't Medford's first cemetery. That one was over there, not too far from the Blackbird Shopping Center. It didn't last very long because, well, the 1890 floods pretty much turned this whole part of the valley into a big old lake that you might want to swim in. Anyway, I'm going to be heading up here to the top, which is the I.O.O.F. circle. And while I'm doing that, Bill, why don't you tell them about that old cemetery? What do you think? Well, Ed, if I can get this microphone working, I'm going to tell you that I'd be more than happy to do that. I think I'm just... There it is. I think that's a handsome dude. Or at least he used to be. In late 1885, nearly 2 years after the creation of Medford itself, city leaders were calling for maybe a cemetery for the town. So they didn't have to go as far as Jacksonville and that sort of thing. Also at about that time, the Medford Lodge of the Independent Order of Oddfellows, the I.O.O.F., was being organized here in Medford. In April of 1887, they purchased nearly 14 acres west of the city for a cemetery. Now, in case you don't know, the Oddfellows is a fraternal and charitable organization still in force today. The name comes from the idea that back in the early 1800s, the idea that somebody would actually want to help somebody who needed help, well, was a little bit peculiar, or maybe even odd. You'll find their symbol, the triple links, on many of the headstones. These triple links that are like a chain link mean friendship, love, and truth. The original I.O.O.F. cemetery, the entrance was at the northwest corner of Lincoln and West Main Street. I hope this is not your house I'm going to be showing you. It extended west from that point to just about Elm Street. This is all pretty much by the Blackbird Shopping Center over there. Now, although the cemetery grounds were improved and fenced in, it quickly became apparent that it was a bad location. Winter rains would transform that whole area into a mud swamp. Water swept down the hill and right into the business district, and they were worried about that. No sooner had a campaign begun to get enough money to move the bodies to a new cemetery than the county was literally swimming in the second worst flood ever to hit Southern Oregon, the Great Flood of 1890. The newspaper reported that the Oddfellows were on the job and moving quickly. The authorities have sensibly concluded to abandon the town cemetery. That's west of town. And they're going to lay in a new cemetery on land procured from Frederick Barneburg. There, no evil effects can result to the town from unfortunate drainage. Fred Barneburg sold them 20 acres of his farm for $700, which sounds like a big deal. It's $19,000, which is still a big deal in today's money. The cemetery was ready in February of 1891 when workers exhumed the bodies that were buried in the old cemetery. There weren't that many, but they were there. Carried them to town on wagons and reinterred them in the new I.O.F. cemetery. I think that Vid must be at the top of the hill by now.
Well, thanks, Bill. Boy, it's getting hot out here. Finally made it to the top of I.O.O.F. Hill, and we're standing right by Fred Barneburg's grave. Fred is here, along with a lot of his relatives. Fred had some of the earliest burials here, even though they're not marked. Those were 3 of his children. First, back in 1878, was Harry, who was born and died almost the same day. Then Harriet, who was 6 years old, and Frank, who was nearly 2, they both died of the same cause, scarlet fever, very common back then. And they both died on the same day. And as I say, neither one of them have a marker here. After Fred and his brother were here for about, almost 9 years, back in 1859, they both decided that they were homesick and they wanted to get back to Iowa. Well, unfortunately, as you sometimes know, what you want isn't always what you really need. They found out that things had changed in Iowa. It wasn't as much fun. There wasn't much work. So they decided to come back. Before he came back, Fred managed to marry Atha. She was a school teacher there, and they all came out this way and settled in. Fred, actually, before he died, had about 2,000 acres that he had bought here in this beautiful Rogue Valley. They had 9 children. Atha, well, she died of what they think was cancer. a few years before Fred. Now, I guess the good news is if you're going to die, people always say you should die doing something you really enjoy. Well, Fred enjoyed fishing. And in 1907, Fred Barneburg, the man who had deeded this land to the people that were putting the cemetery together, the I.O.O.F., in 1907, Fred was fishing on the Rogue River near the Bayou Bridge, and he drowned. But he's up here on the top of the hill telling his story. It's also interesting that, well, one of his daughters, Mollie, later on when the Rogue Manor was being dedicated back in the 60s, she was telling a reporter about a story of her looking down on the valley and actually watching Medford being born. You've got that story, Bill. Why don't you tell it?
Mollie Barneburg had married Dr. James Keene, a dentist, shortly after her mother had died, and I think it was 1903. When the Rogue Manor was being dedicated on the hill in 1961, she was at that ceremony, and her thoughts naturally turned to her childhood. And she told that story to a reporter. It was a story from 1884. Mollie's friend Harriet was whimpering in protest, but Mollie, kept pulling her up the hill. Now, they weren't supposed to be here. And when they returned, their mothers were going to be very unhappy with them and surely give them a terrible scolding. Even at only 10 years of age, Mollie was always in command. "Come on, Harriet," she urged. "We're almost at the top." Well, this was Mollie's favorite playground, and in summer she would lay there and make faces out of the clouds. From the summit, the people looked like tiny mice, and Mollie, she liked to watch them as they scurried all around. She seldom came in winter when it was too wet and too cold, but this year, she was curious. "There it is," Mollie said. They finally had reached the top. The girls were panting, their breath puffing clouds of steam into the January air. Nearly 2 miles below, they could see a pack of mice and machinery. "They're Chinese," said Mollie. "They're building a railroad." It was a memory of 1884, but it still seemed new to her. Although nearly 80 years had passed at the time, Mollie could still see her misty breath as she told her story to that newspaper reporter. "That was Papa's hill," she said. A speaker at the 1961 Manor dedication closed his speech by saying, "Each person who lives here will have an enviable view of the fields, the orchards, and the communities of the beautiful Rogue River Valley." Sitting in the back of the crowd, Mollie Barneburg decided to smile. "Enviable view indeed," she said. 3 generations of Barneburgs had climbed that hill and seen this valley grow. She guessed it was probably time that she shared it with everyone else. "Come on, Harriet," she heard her memory say. "We're almost at the top." Mollie died in 1977 at age 102. She'd been a widow for 42 years. So, let's see where that rascal vid is this moment.
Yeah, Bill. We're going up here to the mausoleum. The original was built in 1925. However, in 1948 they did expand it and bring this portion of it out. Let's take a closer look at that door. Yep, these are beautiful doors. They're not the original. They were put in probably about 8 years ago. Mausoleums got to be popular because a lot of people just didn't want to be buried underground, and I can understand that. So mausoleums, as I say, got very, very popular. In here, you're finding people who were very, very rich and very average people who just saved up enough money to be buried here. Now, some of the richest, well, that was Charlie Palm and his wife. They were some of the richest people in this area. Charlie was said to have been the first millionaire in the entire Rogue Valley. He and Callie are both right here. And I'd like to tell you their story, so why don't we go over here to the Memorial Garden and we'll give you more details on that. Boy, that's quite the building, too. You know, you just had to smile when Charlie would drive by. He was a hands-on, self-made man, a regular visitor to downtown Medford, driving all the time, in his car with his wife and their 2 Cocker Spaniels. Now, even though Charlie was one of the biggest property owners in the entire area, and certainly one of the richest, well, let's just say he was friends with everyone. Charlie and Callie arrived here in Medford in 1888 from Ohio. And almost instantly, well, Charlie began buying property all around the valley. After nearly 50 years of success in the valley, Charlie and Callie decided it was time that they paid back to the citizens of Medford and give them a gift. But before that gift could be given, well, Charlie in 1933 died. Callie, his wife, was determined to see that dream come true. And she was going to finish that project, and she did. She was going to build a memorial, but not to her husband, a memorial to the people of Medford, Oregon. Her final choice as a gift was easy. The Palms were, as we say, animal lovers, and she decided to have a statue carved of a boy taking care of 2 Cocker Spaniels. She went all the way to Italy, one of the most famous quarries of marble in the world. That was back in Carrara, Italy, home of the ancient marble quarries that go back for 2,000 years. The Romans used them. People in Europe building cathedrals used them. It was one of the most known in the world and had some of the finest marble. Locally, the Oregon Granite Company built the base where the statue would sit, and they also made the fountain that was in front. Now, what a lot of people don't know, and they have disappeared, there used to be little fountains on the side where dogs would be able to get a drink of water on a hot day like this. Well, they're not there anymore, but the statue, immaculate, still is. On April 19th, 1935, almost the whole town came to what we call Alba Park now to dedicate the Palm Fountain. Callie Palm was 97 years old when she died. Her life after Charlie's death was filled with dedicated interest in the community, as it always had been, and of course dedication to the Palm philanthropy. Part of that philanthropy was donating enough money for the carillon that still hangs in the tower of the United Presbyterian Church that's right across the street here. They really did a lot for the community, and that statue, if you haven't seen it, and I don't know how you could have missed it, it's beautiful. Give it a look. Say, Bill, didn't you have a friend who told you about his brother who's also buried here in the mausoleum? Seems to me it was a pretty sad story at that, wasn't it?
That would be Aubrey Sander. I don't know if any of you ever met him. Aubrey used to come and visit me all the time when I worked at the Historical Society. And I remember one of the funniest things, because he had a great sense of humor. He was 92, or just had his birthday, came in and he said, "You know, Bill, it's something to be 92. And I said, "Well, Aubrey, you know what? I just don't have very many friends who are 92. He got a grin on his face and he said, "Neither do I." Aubrey, that's in his suave days, was one of the first aviators here in the Medford area. In World War II, he was a flight instructor. His 17-year-old brother, Atha, is also in that mausoleum. Aubrey had literally tears in his eyes when he told me the story of his brother and how he was there when he died, July 7th, 1926. At the time, Aubrey was just about to be 15 years of age. It was a hot, muggy day, he said. That evening, a big thunderstorm came up. It lasted late into the night. Well, the next morning, somebody wanted to use the telephone, and when we picked it up, well, it was dead. So Atha, he said, hey, let's go see if we can fix it. Now, about 200 yards from the house, there was a pole. One of the wires had broken off. Well, we looked the situation over, and we decided, wouldn't be much of a job to fix that. Seemed simple enough, and we'd done it before. Atha, being the oldest and most athletic, shimmied up the pole with his wire wrapped around his body. When he got to the top, well, he pulled the slack from the line. The wire had hung up in some weeds, so he had to give it a big old heave. In doing so, the wire swung up, made contact with the power line. There was a loud whacking sound and a lot of sparks. Atha clung to the pole for a whole second, then he relaxed, and then he fell. I tried to cushion his fall. He fell on me. I wasn't hurt. I jumped up and I let out a yell that probably could have been heard for a mile or more. I laid Atha out flat and started artificial respiration on him. My mother heard my alarm. She came running. She took over the artificial respiration and she told me, go, get some help. Well, the people who lived down the hill, they had a phone. And also that woman was a nurse, a trained nurse. I went over the fence, through the orchard, bolted through their back door. I'll always remember that scene. They were at the table having breakfast. I guess I scared the hell out of them. I came to the door and I yelled, Atha's been electrocuted. Before I finished the sentence, she was out the door, running up the hill. Well, I went directly to their telephone. It was out too. When I got back to the accident, they were doing everything possible to revive him. They worked on Atha for 3, maybe 4 hours. No avail. I really think he died while he was still on the pole, at least I hope so, not knowing what happened. The funeral was July 11th, the day after my 15th birthday. I don't remember very much about it. I do remember that a lot of people were there. He was on the football team, and it seemed like half the 1926 high school to Black Tornado class was there. One other thing I remember. When the service was over, my father and I walked out hand in hand, and I looked up, and I said, Dad, this is a terrible, terrible birthday present. I get choked up on that one because I remember it. Certainly brings back some memories, good and bad. Atha was a good dude, or Atha. Aubrey was a good dude. I'm sure Atha was too. And he used to tell me stories that he probably wouldn't have told anybody else, and I've always cherished those. Some I can't even tell you. He was a rascal, they say. They say he was a rascal. So, anyway, let's turn it back over to that handsome devil, Vic.
Okay, Bill, here I am down the hill in the county, or what they call the Paupers section of the cemetery. Now, buried here are the forgotten people. And, well, with rare exception, every moment of their lives has just about been wiped away. Now, very few at least had their names in the newspapers when they died, but really most of them didn't. And as someone once said, well, you're really never dead until the last person says your name. Well, here, today, we're going to be saying quite a few names, and hopefully bringing some of their stories to life. I want you to come along with me, and I'll tell you what little we know about some of these forgotten souls. Now, most of these people didn't even have a family or enough money to even be buried here with a headstone in the cemetery. And almost everyone here is unmarked. Now, one of the rare exceptions to that is Daniel Fuller, who died in 1922. Now, I haven't been able to find out very much about him. Daniel's buried over here in row number 10. right by that big oak tree. Dan here lies next to Reason Packer Jr., who with his father back in 1854 were some of the first settlers to claim land that eventually would become part of Medford. Reason Jr. wandered back to Medford in 1908, nearly 50 years after he had left. While looking for work, the 52-year-old talked to a reporter, remembering the good old days, especially those Indian wars that he was part of. He said he had been in the Army for a short time over at Fort Klamath, lived in California, but for almost 50 years he had never come back. Reason did remain here in Medford as a laborer until he died at age 79 in April of 1922. Rest in peace, Reason. Let's move on. In row 7, we have a Confederate veteran of the Civil War. Born in Kentucky in 1846, 82-year-old Eugene Jennings had lived in Medford for nearly 20 years when he died of heart trouble in 1929. Eugene, an orphan, is believed to have been a private in the 5th Regiment of Louisiana Infantry. He may have seen action in a number of battles, including Antietam and Gettysburg, before being wounded and captured by the Union. By the end of 1884, his wife and their 3 children had all died. The 3 children died of diphtheria on the very same night. He worked in the Southern Oregon orchards until failing health brought him to the Sacred Heart Hospital across the way here, where he died, just blocks from where he now lies. 3 rows away is Frank Ames, who died near Talent in 1922. He was also a Confederate soldier. Frank was actually with Robert E. Lee when the Army of Virginia surrendered at Appomattox in 1865. He settled in the Applegate Valley in about 1880, worked in the mines, and that's where he spent the rest of most of his 88 years. Oliver Adams was born in Brownsville, Oregon in 1872, but by the time he was 12 years old, the family had moved to Jackson County, where he stayed for the rest of his life. One of the few people we actually have a photograph of. Oliver had been a businessman in Butte Falls when his wife died just 14 days after giving birth to their only daughter, Estella. His brief obituary never gave the cause of his death. It occurred in 1929. There's not much we know about Albert Alberts, who died in 1936, except, well, he was named as a millionaire in a will, but because that will was contested, well, Albert didn't get the money. 5 months after he arrived in Medford, he had died. In one of those anomalies that makes this whole section so frustrating at times, Lucia Anderson and her husband James are both buried here, except they're not buried together. Lucia is up the hill in row 15, and James, well, he's down here in row 9. The couple had come from Minnesota, where they had raised 4 girls and 6 boys. Lucia had died in 1940. That was just about 7 years after her husband James had passed. The New York divorce after 20 years of marriage brought George Coulter to Medford, where he was eking out a very small living as a painter. Now, those who have lived here long enough will remember that there once was a time when you didn't go down to Front Street. It was a pretty bad part of town. Living in a rugged cabin at the back of Harry Hansen's coal yard, the Depression was hitting George's business pretty badly. He frequented a Front Street pool hall where he was well known and, of course, well liked. On September 27th, 1927, it looked like George was just taking a nap in a chair. Well, they tried to wake him, but unfortunately they couldn't. Apparently George died of a heart attack while in the pool room. No one was ever able to reach his ex-wife or their daughter or his sister. And after authorities had searched his cabin, they told a reporter that George was obviously destitute. We only know him as J.M. Davidson from Modesto, California. J.M. was one of those men who decided that, well, living on the road was the thing he wanted to do. Hopping aboard that northbound Southern Pacific train with over 24 other hobos, as they called them at the time, was more than just a bad choice. At about 2 in the morning on March 12, 1917, engine 222 derailed at a crossing just south of Medford. A broken axle scattered 14 cars into twisted piles. J.M. was the most seriously injured. He had a fractured hip, compound fracture of his pelvis. They rushed him to Sacred Heart Hospital, which was just over the hill here from the cemetery. The 33-year-old had died just 6 hours after they picked him up. Of the dozens of babies and young kids who are buried here in this section, perhaps the stories of 2 are the most tragic. Dolores was only 5 days from her 2nd birthday in April of 1934. Her older brothers and sisters were at school, and 2 sisters were playing with her in the house. Before leaving to pick up the mail from her mailbox, a rural mailbox, a quarter of a mile away from the house, their mother told the children to stay out of the house until she got back. Well, kids, you know how that goes. She returned only a few minutes later, but flames were rapidly eating up the walls of the entire house. 2 older daughters were there in the front yard, but baby Dolores, she was missing. Authorities found the babe under the family stove in the kitchen. She probably, they said, tried to hide when the flames were coming. Although her sisters would deny it, the fire chief believed that those 2 girls had been playing with matches. With 4 children remaining, the Everhards were not the only family who couldn't afford a funeral and a burial in this cemetery. 4-year-old Joyce Durham was the 6th child to die of polio in the 1935 epidemic that was raging through Jackson County. The homeless Durhams had made their way south all the way from Hood River up on the Columbia River. It had only been 3 weeks that they had been here in the valley. Now, health authorities found them living in a tent along Birdsey Creek. The Red Cross and county commissioners did find the destitute family a house owned by the county in Jacksonville, and they moved them in, quarantined them, and told them not to leave. 7 members of this family. Now, many Jacksonville residents at the time were not too happy about that, including 2 members of the city council. They protested that the threat of polio had been brought right into their town. Well, commissioners said they had no choice. They had acted to save the stricken child's life. It was to no avail. Polio, with a combination of pneumonia from her time in that tent. She died. Little Joyce, November 18th, 1935. Sad day. Well, Bill, I've got a most interesting spot picked out for you. I'll see you in a bit.
Well, I've got a story for you that's got just about everything. Youth, treasure, greed, love, joy, and of course, tragedy. In March 1894, just across Bear Creek, the Danielson boys, Waldo and Chalmus, were cleaning out a chicken coop on the Roberts place. I was in the back of the building, said 10-year-old Waldo, spading through the trash. When the point of a shovel, it struck something hard. Well, Waldo dug down a few inches, and In the dirt, he found that that hard object was a heavy, half-gallon can. "Well, this can must be filled with rocks," he told 8-year-old Chalmus, his brother. Waldo cut through the can, revealing tobacco sacks, all of them stuffed with coins. "I cut 2 sacks containing $20 coins," Waldo said. "When we looked through all the sacks, they were all gold." Well, they decided to take the coins up to Mr. Roberts' place. "What you got there, boys?" said Mr. Roberts. "It's a can of gold," they both shouted at him. Mr. Roberts told them to hand it over. "We gave it to him," Waldo said. And they walked inside the house, him and his wife, and they closed the door right in our face. And we went back to work. Well, about a half hour later, Mr. Roberts came by to the boys and handed each one of them a nickel. "You know, we put that money there some time ago," Roberts said. "So don't say anything about it to anybody. The good Lord's going to bless you for that." Waldo asked, "How much do you think was in there?" And he said about $7,000, if he counted correctly. 9 years later, the boys had come to the conclusion that, you know what, that maybe those gold coins really belonged to them, not to Roberts. They did bring suit in district court over in Jacksonville in the old courthouse, trying to recover the money. But after hearing their testimony, Judge Hanna, the judge over there, decided he didn't want to let the jury hear the case. Well, the Danielson's attorneys weren't going to go for that. They appealed to the Oregon Supreme Court. In 1904, they won. In his decision, Chief Justice Robert Bean quoted the Danielson boys' testimony that said the can was old, it was rusty, it had been buried in solid earth, it hadn't been recently disturbed, and the building and the property were owned by a whole bunch of different owners over the previous 40 years. He ordered a retrial, ruling that unless Roberts could prove that that money was his, he had to return it to the Danielson boys with 10% interest. Well, an out-of-court settlement awarded the Danielson boys about $6,000. Now, Waldo used his money to buy an interest in the Medford Iron and Foundry Works that stood near the Main Street Bridge. He married in May of 1905. 6 months later, 23-year-old Waldo was dead, struck in the head by bricks that fell from the roof of his very own foundry. What had happened here, men from the city electric company, well, they were running a cable across the corner of his shop. Below, sounds almost familiar here, a horse got tangled up in the wires, jerked that wire just enough to knock off bricks from the corner of the building. The bricks came down and hit him in the head. Waldo's wife sued the city, and she won $5,000 for wrongful death. Brother Chalmus would survive, dying in Sacramento in 1970 at age 84. One of the things I like to say when I tell this story is the quotes that you heard me within reason that I may have added a word or two here or there come from testimony that is on file with the Oregon Supreme Court. These boys said these words, or at least they were transcribed that way. But good for them. That's the way I look at it. Hey, Vin, you said you had a special place.
It is really, really hot. Oh, man. Oh, gosh, Bill. Sorry. Taking a little bit of break. It's really, really hot out here, you know? I mean, I'm not back in the library like you are. Air conditioning and all that stuff. Hey, this is one of the more interesting places you're going to find out here at the I.O.O.F. Hard to say. Eastwood Cemetery. I mean, really, look at this. Where else in the cemetery are you going to find a concrete bench, a concrete tree, and a bird? Except somebody somewhere along the line took the bird off the pole. Henry Jansen married his wife Emma in 1888, and they lived in Chicago. Henry had been a stonemason and did some brickwork for his father-in-law, so he was pretty talented, and he's the man who put this all together. Here it says, "At rest," and this is Emma. We're visiting with her today. In 1912, after a stint in Texas, they came to Medford. Here, Henry set up a cement brick company, and Emma kept the books. Now, her daughter, Florence, came along with them. Sadly, by the end of 1915, things weren't looking so good for Henry. First of all, his daughter had gotten married and moved to San Francisco, and Emma, his wife, had died. Well, with his artistic skill, what Henry decided to do was leave a memorial for her. Henry fashioned a concrete tree and branch, placed it here. Attached to the tree is a concrete book with the dates of Emma's birth and death and a single word that expressed his loss: broken. What a great memorial, huh? Henry stayed in Medford until 1920, and he died in California in 1945. The sad part is we really don't know very much about what Henry built around here in the Rogue Valley, although he must have done a lot. One thing we do know, though, is over there on Oakdale, he did construct in 1916 the St. Mark's Episcopal Church. He did all the stonework. He was the contractor in charge. Well, there you go. What a great story. Say, Bill, if I'm not mistaken, don't you have a story about politics and people maybe stealing ballots, fake elections, that sort of thing? Why don't you tell that story while I move on?
We weren't happy to have ended before the wind blows your way. I guess we got a hurricane out there today, too. Henry isn't buried here. He's buried, I believe, south of San Francisco. He left about 5 years after his wife died. There seemed to be something a little bit fishy about the November 1932 election. Not nationally, that's when Franklin Roosevelt won his first term in office, but locally. In Jackson County, the obvious favorite, the incumbent sheriff, surprisingly lost his race, and a rabble-rousing candidate had won a commissioner's seat. Now, there was talk of a rigged election and ballot stuffing. There were two sides to this conflict. There were those who were supporting the idea of the current government, and those who were disgusted and with the established politicians, and they hated the local press. In short, the people were demanding an end to what they were calling gang rule of the people. Now, no one supported the opposition more than Llewellyn Banks, who was editor of the Medford Daily newspaper. Banks was embroiled in accusations of business improprieties, and a grand jury was already investigating his finances, and he was soon to lose his newspaper. His newspaper editorials said that real American patriotism followed Protestant Christianity. He said Jews were a menace to a free society. He supported the formation of something you may not have heard of, the khaki shirts. These were American fascists who were fashioning themselves after Adolf Hitler's brown shirts. The defeated sheriff asked for a recount. The courts agreed. For nearly 4 months, the ballots were safely stored in a vault in the courthouse. Now, that vault was really nothing more than a room that had reinforced walls, a very strong lock, and a window without bars. On the night of February 20th, 1933, the day before the recount was to take place, Banks and his associates destroyed an estimated 10,000 ballots. A number of arrests were made. Llewellyn Banks was implicated eventually, and a warrant for his arrest was issued. Banks had already said, anybody who tries to arrest me, I'm going to kill him. Well, that job fell to 61-year-old Constable George Prescott. He was accompanied by State Trooper James O'Brien to the door. When Prescott knocked on the door on March 16th, Mrs. Banks answered. Prescott apologized but said, "I have a warrant to arrest your husband." When Mrs. Banks started to close the door, O'Brien said, well, Mr. Prescott put his foot in the doorway and said he'd give him the warrant to read. Well, as Constable Prescott reached for the warrant, Banks, with his rifle in his hand, said, "Look out!" And he fired a fatal bullet. George Prescott fell back onto O'Brien and died perhaps instantly. Banks surrendered, claiming his shooting of Prescott was nothing more than shooting a burglar. 2 months later, he was sentenced to life in the Oregon State Prison. And there he died in 1945. It was standing room only for Prescott's memorial service at the Medford Armory. Over 3,000 people there. This armory used to be on Bartlett, not too far from where the current, do they still have cars there? The car lot over there. The large procession to the cemetery included 114 automobiles. They were filled with mourners, as were all the sidewalks. So ended one of the most tragic moments in Medford history. Collections were taken up. If you've been to Aubrey Park, you may see a stone out there that is dedicated to George Prescott. Prescott Park, up there on Roxy Ann, there's the marker up there also that's dedicated to George Prescott. So, let's get on to this.
It's really cool under this after all this heat. Oh man, I'm telling you. I want to take you up here to see Olive Murray. Family story. It's pretty interesting on this 17-year-old who died back in 1901. The story goes something like this. This family story is kind of sad, but nobody knows for sure if it's true. Olive Murray was 17 years old, and one night, or early morning, she rushed out the front door holding her abdomen that was apparently in pain. She almost forgot her coat. Temperatures were in the mid-teens, and there was 19 inches of snow on the ground. Well, she made her way all the way over to the railroad tracks, and there she sat down leaning against an oak tree, waiting for her baby to be born. Well, they found her the next morning. She had died, and there she was, all alone. The interesting thing about Olive's marker here is if you look on the back side here, well, it says also buried here is the son of her mother and father. Now, it's interesting that they say that. Were they just trying to cover up her baby, or did she have a baby? It's kind of a controversy that never ends. So, as we say, were the parents actually telling the truth or not? It's hard to say. What we do know is there was 19 inches of snow on the ground. Temperatures were cold. The interesting thing is her mother and father aren't buried in this cemetery. They're buried in Central Point. So the controversy, as I say, continues to this day. Was Olive Murray pregnant or not? We can tell you that 9 months before she died, the paper reported that she was sick and that it had turned to measles. Well, those measles led to 9 months of pain, being out of school or work, and they said that she died from effects of that, inflammatory rheumatism. Now, is it a true story or not? Who knows? I mean, who are we? Who are we to say that the family doesn't have the story correct? One way or the other, it's an interesting tale. And rest in peace, Olive Murray. Okay, Bill, I guess you've got something about World War II that sounds pretty exciting. Why don't we listen to you, and I'll head back over here.
This is a story about Colonel Robert Emmens. He was a lieutenant and co-pilot on one of the bombers that bombed Japan during the Doolittle raid on Tokyo. On April 18, 1942, 16 B-25 bombers, Mitchells, took off from the aircraft carrier Hornet. Emmens' plane was forced to land in Russia, and he and the crew were held for over a year as virtual prisoners until they managed to escape. Now, he told his story after the war in a book that he called Guests of the Kremlin. Born in Medford in 1914, Emmens had graduated from Medford High in 1931, attended the University of Oregon as a music major, but by 1937, he had enlisted in the Army Air Corps and was receiving training at Kelly Field down in Texas and other airfields across the country. During that 1942 mission, Emmens' crew was supposed to land in China, but their fuel supply ran low, and they landed some 40 miles from Vladivostok. If you look on the map, you can see that this Vladivostok is on this little peninsula here, China's over here. They almost made it to China, but not quite. I hadn't realized that until I looked at the map. We were told, Emmens said, that the government of Russia and the United States had decided that we should be interned until further notice under international law. Well, the crew of 5 were moved to many different locations in the Soviet Union, always under guard. But as their captivity lengthened, they began making plans for an escape. Finally, after 13 months, they were free. But it hadn't been easy. There was a truck ride, then a run up a mountainside, on their stomachs through a minefield, and then again, another bumpy truck ride for miles and miles and miles. They finally reached the Iranian city of Mashhad, where they made their way to the British consulate and eventual freedom. Now, after the war, Emmens remained in the Air Force, and he had many tours around the world, including in Japan. I was assigned to language school for a year before we went there, he said. But all I ever had to do with the Japanese before that war was, well, I hated them for Pearl Harbor. But you know, after spending a little time over there, I fell in love with that country. Emmens retired from the military, returned to Medford in 1964. In April of 1992, just a few days before he was planning to attend the 50th anniversary of the Doolittle Raiders, he died. Truly a historic story that few of us know even exists up at that cemetery. So I think we have one more report from Vid. We're a little bit long today, for obvious reasons. Oh, she's not here. So let's go to Vid.
Yeah, Bill, we're here with Harry Butler and his wife. Harry has a interesting story that most people have forgotten. He came to Medford in 1901. He was the first osteopathic doctor, I think in the entire valley, perhaps in southern Oregon. He had come from Iowa after being up in the gold fields of Alaska for about 9 months. Didn't make his fortune, apparently. And he was a sportsman. So one of the first things he did was started playing second base for the Medford Grays, the Medford baseball team at the time. When Medford needed another fire company, Harry stepped up, and they created Hose Company No. 2 and elected Harry president. Now, that's not the most interesting part about Harry's story. To get enough money for supplies for the fire department, Harry came up with an idea. He came from Iowa, where they played basketball, and he introduced basketball to the Rogue Valley. Yep, they had a basketball game to raise money. And that was on March 2nd, I believe, of 1903. Well, it was his claim to fame, that's for sure. The firemen divided themselves up into 2 teams. One wore black jerseys, the other ones wore white. I don't know about you, but when we were in high school, it was shirts and skins, but, it's 1903. So there it was, that first game. Now, Charlie Bosham did break his finger. He was on the Whites, and that was early in the first half. But by the second half, things were about to change. The Whites were up 36-27, but by the end, even though Kobe Oceanbridge lost his pants while going down the court, the Blacks managed to come out with a victory 81-77, and basketball was born in the Rogue Valley. It was a success. They raised $20 that night when they played that basketball game. Now you might go, whoo, big deal. That's $550 in today's money, at least. And not only that, Harry had done something spectacular. He had introduced the excitement of basketball to the Rogue Valley. And just think, over 100 years of thrills, chills, black tornadoes, and everything else. You can't beat it, friends. Back to you, Bill.
All I guess I'd like to say is, it's not easy to find out this information, and that's why people don't know what's going on up that cemetery unless you have somebody who's actually up there. But every one of those graves, headstones, has a story. Some of them are more interesting than others, but unfortunately, with a generation or two, most people's stories disappear, except within the family. There's so many stories up at the cemetery. And I do say, you ought to visit once in a while. Anyway, if you have any questions, or you want to go, we're done. What can I do for you? Thank you.